look I breathed to my friend, turquoise. She was not impressed and continued poking around the bead store. I stayed with the beads, taking one out at a time, turning each bead over and over. One was a swirl of blues and greens, browns and black, and a streak of orange. It was a 3/4 inch miniature blue-green earth. I held her in the palm of my hand, imagining all of the life teeming on this little earth. I imagined the waters teeming with fish, sea turtles and plankton, coral reefs at the divide between ocean and shore, animals and people cohabitating on the land, the skies filled with birds. I chose 4 more beads of varying sizes and colors, a handful of turquoise, a handful of planets. Standing in line at the cash register, I was ripped out of my reverie when the sales clerk weighed the beads and said, "That'll be $56. $56? It was far more than I expected or would ever pay for beads. Torn between leaving the beads to save the money and spending the money to care for the planets, I bought the beads. And I care for the planet. This impulsive purchase led to one of my longest lasting spiritual practices. For years after I bought those turquoise beads, I kept them close to me. At the kitchen table during meals, I focused on the beads as representatives of the earth. I carried them from room to room. I placed them next to me on the couch, on my lap, on the coffee table. If they were covered with miscellaneous papers and lost under piles of books, I'd dig them out and place them on top of the mess. I spent hours holding the beads, marveling at the beauty of the earth. I carried the beads with me when I interviewed for seminary. When I began seminary, I held them in my hands, hoping that these little planets would ground me in the years ahead. One of my first seminary assignments was to bring in something to add to our class altar. Each person was invited to place an altar on the table and share our spiritual practice. At the time, I had no idea what a spiritual practice was, but I knew what I wanted to add to the altar. As I placed my 5 turquoise beads on the altar, I shared, "Every morning, I say hello to the sky. I hold these beads in kindness. They remind me of the planet." In the introduction of the book Faithful Practices, Eric Walker Wilkstrom, inspired by Henry David Thoreau, proposes that there are 2 ways of living. One is a life truly lived, fully, vividly alive, while the other might be called mere existence. Wilkstrom sums this up: life and not life. He adds that this dichotomy has been found throughout the world religions. He goes on, over and over in the religious and spiritual traditions that humans have developed, we find the teaching that there are 2 ways of living in the world, in a way that is truly alive, and a way that is not really alive. Life and non-life. Wilkstrom proposes a definition of spirituality as the quest to move from non-life to life, from being asleep to waking up, from death to life. He continues, spiritual practice grows out of the awareness that this transition is not easy, and that once achieved, takes reinforcement. He compares spiritual practice to the creative practice. He writes, "If you want to really make progress, you need to practice, often, regularly. It takes some discipline." He concludes, there is a reason that spiritual practice is often called spiritual discipline. Inadvertently, my practice of holding turquoise beads and imagining them to be the earth helped me to wake up. As I pictured the planet in my hands, I moved out and away from my day-to-day struggles and questions. I was reminded that there is more to life than my own issues and concerns. In recent years, I began a practice where after greeting the directions and the earth, I turned my attention to the sky and the winged beings, the birds and flying ones. I thanked them for the perspective of the bird's eye view. The winged ones remind me to see far and wide. I'm reminded that my life is just one speck in the long history of life on this planet that stretches far into the past and into the future. There's something about this perspective that moves me from merely existing into being present to a fully lived, vivid life. Or it did in the past. At this point, I've pretty much dropped all of the spiritual practices that have stained me through the years. On one hand, I assume that eventually I'll pick them up again, as it's sort of a necessity as one is a religious leader. However, in the meantime, I'm bogged down by the certainty that I do not have time. No time to meditate, no time to hold the turquoise beads, no time to pray, no time to greet the directions or the morning sky, no time to live. I have slipped into a state of mere existence. This mere existing is filled with dread about the future of this nation, concern for those who are labeled and treated as less than human, and fear for the future of life on this planet. I know that many of you are worried about these things too. It has been said that if you can't find time to meditate for 10 minutes, then you need to meditate for an hour. I want to listen to this. I need to listen to this. And you may want to listen to this and need this as well. We are existing in worrisome times that undermine our humanity and efforts to live fully, truly, and vividly alive. We all need to develop and maintain practices that can sustain us through the long haul. There are different kinds of activities that we do at different times in our lives that can be understood as spiritual practices. In order to work as spiritual practices, we need to approach them as such, with intention and presence of mind. Eric Walker Wilkstrom, in the book Faithful Practices, names 8 spheres of practice. He feels that if your goal is to live a full and well-rounded spiritual life, it is important to engage with each of the practices from time to time throughout our lives. These 8 practices, are personal practices that we do on our own, communal practices that we do with others, such as worshiping in worship together, partnership practices that we do with one other person, mind practices that engage our minds and our thinking, soul practices that make use of our imagination and creativity, body practices that get our physical selves involved, family practices that are found in and around the people with whom we live and interact, and last is justice practices that engage us in the work of helping heal this broken world. Again, the 8 spheres of spiritual practice are personal, communal, partnership, mind, body, soul, family, and justice. Take a moment to review your life and your days. Which of these have you practiced? Which of these do you currently practice? Which practices are you most comfortable with? Which practices do you find challenging? How might you bring these practices into your life today? Different combinations of these practices throughout our lives can help us to live as more engaged persons and can help each of us grow deeper into our relationships with ourselves, with others, with the earth, and with that which encompasses all, which some call God. These practices can provide comfort and security in challenging times. As Unitarian Universalists, a majority of us focus on mind practices, those activities and efforts that engage our minds and our thinking. We value reason to help us find meaning and uncover truths to the big questions of life and existence. Often you use like an intellectually stimulating sermon, somewhat like a college lecture. However, this tendency to focus on the written word and mind practices causes us to neglect those practices that engage the imagination, creativity, and our hearts. We may discount the other elements in our shared community worship service and in our personal practices. Over the coming months, I hope to bring more imagination and creativity into worship. Don't worry, the sermon will remain the same. I hope you will allow your imagination, creativity, and hearts to be opened and enlivened by our communal practice. Perhaps together, we will hold metaphorical and literal turquoise beads in the palms of our hands and imagine that the world is not as it is, but how it can be, vivid and flourishing, alive. May it be so.